All right, coin traders, what's going on? Ugly day that we saw just close, so don't need to restate the obvious after that. But obviously want to talk about what some scenarios are now and what likely outcomes, what we're expecting, especially because we had such a huge flush here on the most recent day, and especially after 4 days of straight pullback, after a very nice breakout and a back test that looked like it was going to break out again. And unfortunately, this is kind of the reality that we are tied to the rest of the crypto space, because Algo was actually in a very nice position to see a lot of nice upside if, in fact, we would have been able to see the rest of the crypto space either stay flat or even potentially rally slightly. Or honestly, even if we did see a slight pullback across the rest of the crypto space, this is actually a very nice setup. And in the last video, we were actually talking about on the shorter term how we were actually looking at this setup being a potential double top, which is exactly what we ran into, rejecting from just below 12 cents at about 1080. So obviously after breaking this support line here, coming in right at about 1120, just below that, that was our confirmation on this candle that we were heading to new lower lows. But obviously then whether or not we were expecting a little bit of a bounce to come in, and then now the huge flush that we saw across crypto when we did have the announcement that SpaceX dumped $370+ million of Bitcoin. So what happens now? Well, as you can see, we're still not necessarily in a scenario where we're going to be rebounding just yet. Man, so in scenarios like this, one of two things has to happen. We either have to have the price normalize or we have to have the sentiment normalize. And so what exactly do I mean by that? Well, essentially what happens is that on these huge flushes, sentiment's so bad that we have to get sentiment normalized, which means that usually takes either a period of consolidation along the current level, or the price has to normalize, which means we typically see support come in and then a rally to recover. Now, most of the time, especially in markets lately, we've been seeing sentiment normalize, which does mean consolidation and establishing these levels as that newly established price level. Now, personally, I'm still under the belief that we are going to be due for a little bit of reprieve and a little bit or a lot of bit of oversold bounce here. And we're going to go into that here in a second in the video. So make sure if you do like this type of content, you do hit that thumbs up, like, and subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future analysis and updates like this. And also make sure if you're not following me yet over here on Twitter or X, make sure to drop me a follow at coin_trades is the handle. We do talk about a lot of different things. And one of the things that we have talked about recently over on X or Twitter, if you still want to call it that, is just the most recent pullback, how this isn't a sustainable pattern to the downside. And these type of patterns always have to reverse in any capacity. So even, for example, if we do invert this pattern, you can see that if this was in a bullish direction, this would actually not be sustainable with actually retracing and establishing a support level. So if we actually go ahead and invert this chart once again, you can see that even though we don't have confirmation of a trend change on the shorter term just yet, with the establishment of a higher low and new higher highs, ultimately end up changing this trend. We know that we are coming up on that here in a second. Oops. And so especially if we do zoom in, for example, and we are on the 1 hour chart right now, just looking at the big downside lower shadow of the magnitude of this overall candle. Now, this is very normal, especially when we see 10% plus candles, because we always end up seeing a huge oversold bounce that does come in within the same candle. And that is pretty much where we go through this sideways period of consolidation, then ultimately get confirmation of a bearish breakout, or whether or not we're actually going to see the price normalize and we start to see a bearish movement to the upside. But like we mentioned, in this current scenario, we are still very much set up and tied to Bitcoin right now, which is still not the best current setup. So Bitcoin itself also had a big period of a big lower shadow on the massive, insane flush. And even earlier today, we saw Bitcoin just absolutely tearing to the bearish downside, more so than a lot of the altcoins, which actually, like we talked about over on Twitter, was good for dominance. So for example, if we look at the crypto caps, and you can see that the dominance itself has been dropping. So if we look at the daily, you can see we have been pulling back here, actually forming a lower for dominance. But one of the things to keep in mind too is that we're actually flirting with the idea of breaking below the $1 trillion line. And actually, if you see today on the initial flush, we actually did get down to a low market cap of 992.99 billion. Now, the reason I bring that up is because although it does sound bearish, we still have plenty of opportunity for longer term growth to the upside. So even in the shorter term, despite seeing a little bit of freak out and a lot of bearish pressure and sentiment, which we actually were expecting due to tightening Bollinger Bands, we're actually entering fractal patterns in periods that we have seen before. Now, most recently, back in March, we saw a similar flush, but the unfortunate catalyst in that event was we did have the Silicon Valley Bank crash. So a lot of that did flock money into crypto, and there's not really indication that anything similar will be occurring this time. So typically what that is going to mean is just a little bit more consolidation. It doesn't even have to be that much of magnitude, but overall, we are going to see a tightening range on crypto, not necessarily any magnificent breakout here. Now, what is so significant about this move that we just saw close for Bitcoin on the day is that if we pull up the technicals and specifically the RSI Relative Strength Index, we can see that we're massively oversold right now on the daily. So currently we're looking at 19.94. The day that just closed, we're looking at 21.48. And so if I actually draw a line at 21.48, then what you can see is that if we zoom out, we haven't even touched this level except for only a handful of times. And so most recently, the time that we saw it last was actually in June of 2022, so over a year ago. And then after that flush, we actually ended up seeing a rally total of about 37% over the course of about 2 months. So if we actually do a little bit of a bars pattern here and talk about what potentially that could look like in the current setup, if we actually take this move, then if we do get a similar pattern to play out, we could be looking at testing the highs about 32,000 once again in a time period, basically by the middle of October. I don't think it's necessarily going to be playing out like that, but overall, we can see that every other time that the Bitcoin daily RSI has been that much oversold, we actually do get these types of patterns. So previously, before that, we were looking at January of 2022. In that instance, we were looking at an oversold bounce pattern playing out that was about 36% in about just over 2 weeks. If we extrapolate it over the longer move, we were looking at almost basically 40% over just over 2 months, which is very similar to what we saw on the time back in June, about 2 months for 40%. Now, zooming out even farther, the last time before that we actually saw the daily RSI for Bitcoin that low was actually the March 2020 COVID crash. And obviously, you know what happens after that. Now, I'm not necessarily thinking that that's going to be what we see, but realistically, more based on where we are in the cycle, it probably will end up being like this pattern that we're looking at from about September of 2019, where we actually saw a very big sell-off after a period of consolidation that did lead to the daily RSI getting overextended to that level before seeing one more pullback and then one more pump rally, which essentially was the heartline of this consolidation move. So even in that instance, from the low after the flush, we were still looking at about a 25% gain over the course of about a month. So the point I'm trying to make is that we still have to look at longer term fundamentals and technicals, because in this type of market, it's the longer term charts that actually are what's needed to normalize and stabilize, because they do carry a little bit more weight than some of the shorter terms that are a lot more unpredictable. Like we said, though, that doesn't mean we can't actually see a little bit more flush to the downside, especially as we do try to normalize sentiment, which doesn't look like it's happening just yet. So until that happens, sentiment's not normalized, and we will start to see a little bit more bearish downside pressure. Sentiment normalizing is what stabilizes the price, and that's typically, like on all the other patterns, we see this consolidation and a slow ratchet back to the upside. So we are looking at a period of time to play out to unfortunately reverse all of this damage that we experienced today. So sorry for that little bit of a tangent over on Bitcoin, but that's how we are playing out, because we are still correlated. And like we said, if we didn't get those type of moves, we actually would have seen a very nice upside move, especially after this great rally confirmation pattern and then follow through. So it is very unfortunate and obviously very frustrating to get this type of sell-off across the rest of the crypto space, because all algo supporters and investors definitely can't catch a break, especially after this nice setup that we were looking at had a really great potential for a lot of upside and great things. So now one of the things that I want to do is actually talk about some downside targets, since we are still in a bearish pattern here and did break out from unfortunately had a very nice support level going here at about 1055 down to about 1050. And so especially since we did put in an all-time low now for algo coming in at 0.0873, do need to talk about some downside targets. And specifically what I want to look at first is basically assuming this is a consolidation pattern. So taking from about 15 cents down to about 11 cents. And if we take that from the top of the move, then you can see that our lower downside target is going to be at about 7.5 cents. So it is very possible and very plausible that we could actually see a retracement continue until down about this level. Now, personally, I think that cryptos have been getting so beat up lately that if this does happen and this is a level that we see, this probably will be the lowest level that we actually see for a while. And despite all the calls for 5 cents and all of that, they potentially might happen. Anything is possible in crypto, but based on a technical, it's just not the most likely right now. And that's why 7.5 is going to be the extremely strong downside support that we are looking at in the event that we do continue to see price action push into the downside. So personally, if that does happen, then that will be where I'm actually personally looking to expend a lot of my other capital into a very nice long position for Algorand. Obviously not financial advice, that is just my personal setup and strategy. And then even if we do push farther to the downside, it's not going to be potentially even that much farther. So if we do get fills right around 7.5 and potentially we even go down to about 5 cents, a 32% move is definitely sustainable down to about the 5-cent level before ultimately rallying back up, because even back up to 12 cents still would be over 55% gain from that move. Once again, not a complete call. This is just the technical level where I'm comfortable putting the rest of my longer term capital in. And obviously there is still a potential that we don't even see prices get down to that level. And so even if we want to check targets on this a different way too, we can even look at a logarithmic based Fibonacci extension from that move down to the previous low up to the bounce at about 14 cents. Then you can see the 100% logarithmic extension is going to be coming in at 7.9 cents. So we are going to have a zone there from about 7.9 down to about 7.56. So all of this is going to be the buffer and cushion zone that I actually look to start getting a lot of my fills in. Would definitely love to know what everyone else's targets are and what you think of mine down in the comment sections below. Do love getting back to each and every one of you as always. Always appreciate all the continued love on the support and the channel. It does mean so much. If you are getting long-term entries, I definitely can't fault you right now because I think in the longer-term scheme of things, these are all great entries no matter where you get, even if you don't actually nail the bottom, which we're not ever trying to do. As always, not financial advice, but do hope you gained something out of the show today. And if you did, please hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe if you have not done so just yet. That is going to do it for now, though, so stay safe, take care, everyone, and I will catch you back in the next video.